A lawsuit threatens to take away a new education program here in Utah, but is it on solid legal ground?
All of those kinds of questions really aren't court questions. They're legislative questions, and that's why we're concerned that the UA has gone this route and ignored the body that should be making a decision like this.
On this episode, we explain the renewed fight over Utah's education choice program. We talk to a parent who's counting on this program to help improve the education for her kids, and we give you expert insight into the lawsuit itself and the merits of education choice. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn. On this week's episode, we're talking about education choice. We've, of course, all seen the news coverage around the country of many states enacting or expanding education choice programs. Here in Utah, we've done that as well. We're going to dive into the Utah Fits All scholarship program because there's now a lawsuit from the Utah Education Association challenging this new program. They argue that it's not constitutional. We're going to dive into the constitutional and legal arguments as well as the policy case for the program. But first, we wanted to get a real story of someone who's affected by this, someone on the ground who's living this issue every day. So we decided to talk to a parent right here in Utah who is a recipient of the Utah Fits All scholarship program to share her experience with us. Joining us now is Cammie Isle. She is a Utah mother of 4 from Roy, and she's a homeschool teacher for her kids and also a recipient of the Utah Fits All scholarship for her 3 oldest kids. Cammie, thanks so much for joining us on Defending Ideas.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So I wanted to talk to you to get sort of a real on-the-ground experience. There's, of course, all of this discussion and debate and commotion around the Utah Fits All scholarship with the recent lawsuit that we'll get into in more detail. But what I really wanted to talk to you about was your experience homeschooling your kids, your experience looking for resources, and as a recipient or an awardee, rather, of the Utah Fits All scholarship. And when you and I were talking before, you mentioned an experience with one of your kids as far as struggling with writing and trying to find some resources to help him there. Can you tell that story? Help us understand what it's like to be trying to figure out how do I help my child in this area where they're struggling and find access to what they need.
Sure. I mean, I've been homeschooling my kids since the beginning. So my oldest, I've had the opportunity to watch him grow from an emerging reader to, he'll be entering 5th grade this fall. Time goes by so fast. But one thing he's always struggled with was writing. And so I'm generally of the opinion that kids do the best they can with, the best they can do. So often we just kind of put it aside and we moved on with other strengths. And now we're kind of down to a point where we needed to drill down into writing. But he struggles with the handwriting and just, the hand strength and putting his ideas on the paper and getting all those steps down. And I wasn't finding the resources that I needed, at least in our budget, because, in homeschooling, you try and keep it on a reasonable shoestring budget. But this scholarship got me really excited because I can look at curriculum that I wasn't able to afford before, which opens up a whole new world of things. So I was able to find some more customizable type curriculum to help him with the writing process, but also to be able to get a laptop for him to be able to type instead of using the handwriting, which he struggles with on a physical basis. But also I realize that, after this many years of struggle, there may be some underlying stuff that I'm not qualified to take care of. And so I can get him some tutoring. I can get him some therapy if that's what's needed. But we can work with his pediatrician, and we can kind of see what there is available to help get him, on the road to writing better. And it helps the self-esteem. It helps. He knows he struggles, and so being able to give him that boost was a huge thing. And so when we were able to figure out that we were recipients of the scholarship, all of my kids were very, very excited about the prospect. They all had their own ideas of what we wanted to do.
Cammie, it sounds like with your oldest that I mean, did you try different things over the years and kind of nothing worked, again based on what you were able to access based on resources and things you had available to you? But what was there a realization of, well, he needs something specific. I need to find something that essentially can be a custom tailored resource to help him. It's individual to his needs to help him learn and grow.
Yes, exactly. Because, anything on pretty much the one size fits all of public school is about what I had access to on the internet for very low price. But there's different ways the kids' brains work, and you kind of need to work with those. So there's the more specialized curriculums that do get pricey. I mean, those are several $100s, and now we need to catch up levels. So you're talking about 2-3 levels in 1 year. That's way out of the price range that I was in. But also just the very specifics of, okay, we need to get from point A to point B to point C, and his brain needs to be able to focus and to move from those steps. And nothing I had access to was really clicking with him. We tried bite-sized pieces, shorter sessions. We tried hand exercises for the handwriting. Tried a whole bunch of things. I did hours of research and just trying to find what I could access. And I realized at some point, this is not working. And so all I could do was set it aside and hope for the best in another year. And so this scholarship is a huge blessing.
Cammie, there's something you mentioned that I want to highlight because it resonates with me on a personal level. But when you said that there's, different kids learn in different ways, their brains work differently, and so having sort of one approach for all kids, often it doesn't work in a lot of instances. And I think of my own kids. My wife and I, we have 2 little kids, a toddler and a baby, and already we're seeing a lot of differences in temperament and sort of style, I guess you could say, between our 2 boys. And so I want to ask you about how does it feel to have a resource like the Utah Fits All Scholarship viewed through that lens, this realization of, well, my kids are different. They learn in different ways. They need different things. Does this feel like sort of a boost for your ability to address the individual and distinct needs your kids have when it comes to learning? Does this help address that in a way that's meaningful to you?
Oh, absolutely. Using my son as an example, he's a very analytical child. He doesn't do a lot with the creative. He doesn't like drawing. He doesn't like anything like that. So most of the things that I would find appeal more to the artistic side of children, doodle this or creative writing prompts or what have you. None of that clicks with him. Now, that would work perfectly fine for my daughters, who are just that kind of creative mind where they like to make believe and things like that. But my son needs something more analytical, truthfully. Something that can explain to him how his brain puts the things together, which really is not typical in a child, in children's curriculum. Again, they kind of appeal more to that whimsical side of children, which, again, it doesn't work for everyone. Like I said, I mean, for some of my kids, that would be just fine. But for him, not so much.
The last thing I want to ask you, Cammie, and then and a little bit we'll dive into, with some of our policy experts here at Sutherland, into the actual lawsuit itself that we're talking about today and some of the legal and policy debates around the Utah Fits All Scholarship. So I want our listeners to stay tuned for that deeper dive. But Cammie, as we wrap up with you, I want to ask kind of what's next for your family. What are you, anticipating in the future with respect to this scholarship program as far as dates and timelines? When will you get to start, benefiting from this? And also, what's kind of the responsibility for you as a parent, as a recipient of this for your kids? What things do you need to do in order to be compliant with this new program? Sure.
So the scholarship is funded in August. August 7th is when the funds will be there in our ESA account. Our fiscal year begins in July, so if there are expenses we need to take care of before that August 7th date, we save our receipts for reimbursement, and we go through that process. But as far as what I'm looking forward to is the future of the program, as I'm hoping that this is going to build a really beautiful thing for my family year after year, that we'll be able to expand those offerings, not just with my older son and his writing, but as my daughters. They have, my one daughter has a beautiful gift for art, and so she'll be able to really blossom in that, as we were able to get her some professional art lessons, which I obviously can't offer her. But also, we can expand our home library, which is a huge blessing. We have I have MS, and so we don't get to go out a whole lot. So sometimes a trip to the library is a little beyond our weekly activities. And so being able to have a home library that we can access is a whole lot of fun. And my kids go through books pretty quickly. We've read most of the things on our shelf already. As far as accountability goes with our kids, at the end of the school year, or by the end of the school year, I have to put together a portfolio for each child to show what they've done throughout the year. So how they've grown from the beginning to the end of the year. I have the opportunity to kind of make it multimedia if I want. I can use pictures, videos, the written word, but I can put that together to show that I've used my funds well. And I feel like that's really important. Because I realize this is a huge blessing for our family, not one that was afforded to everybody. There were 27,000 applicants and only 10,000 awards. So we're part of that blessed group, and we feel a very, very deep responsibility to the program to make sure that we're using it well, that we're using it responsibly, but also that we follow all the rules that go along with the program.
Well, Cami, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your experience with our listeners. I think we focus on these issues so often through the lens of policy and debate and in this case, a legal analysis, and that's incredibly valuable. But it is essential when we are able to incorporate these normal stories, because these are policy decisions and legal decisions that affect real, regular Utahns every day. So it's really helpful to have you come on and share that perspective and your experience. So I want to thank you for your time, and best of luck in all of your efforts as you're helping your kids to learn and grow. And just really appreciate your time with us today on Defending Ideas.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, that was Cami Isle, Utah mother of 4 from Roy here in Utah, one of the Utah Fitz Scholarship recipients. We're going to take a quick break and be right back with more on this issue. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Stick around.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn. We're going to continue our conversation about Utah's education choice program called Utah Fits All and the lawsuit that is now happening trying to take this program away from the thousands of Utahns who have applied for and been accepted to receive scholarship funds under this program. I'm excited to bring on a couple of experts to dive deeper into the legal questions and sort of make a policy defense of this issue. But first, I want to remind you, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit defendingideas.org. From there, you can access previous episodes and conversations. You can also find Defending Ideas on any of the major podcast platforms. Wherever you like to get your shows, just search for Defending Ideas and click that subscribe button. You can also subscribe to the Sutherland Institute YouTube channel. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit the little bell icon in the corner so you get notified each time a new episode drops. Again, you can find access to all of that and more at defendingideas.org. Joining me now are Bill Duncan and Christine Cooke Fairbanks. Bill is our Constitutional Law and Religious Freedom Fellow, and Christine is our Education Policy Fellow. Bill and Christine, thanks so much for coming back to the show, Defending Ideas, to talk about this issue.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thank you.
So I want to dive into the lawsuit. You both co-authored an op-ed together in the Deseret News that argues essentially that the lawsuit itself, the Utah Education Association is pushing on this program, is flawed on a couple of levels. Essentially, you argue that Utah Fits All is constitutionally and legally sound, and also that from a policy standpoint, it's a good program that's going to help Utahns. And so to really help us understand that, I want to help our listeners understand the lawsuit itself. So maybe starting with you, Bill, and then Christine, would love you to weigh in as well. What exactly is the lawsuit arguing? The UEA, what are they alleging in this lawsuit?
I want to say that everybody listening will learn more probably from Christine than me. But having said that, I'll take a stab at an answer. So the basic argument, as I understand it, there's some things that aren't entirely clear yet about what they're thinking, but the basic intent seems to be that because the state constitution provides that the state will create a public school system that will be overseen by the state board, that any attempt to provide any education resources to anybody outside of just a kind of a very traditional public school setting is unconstitutional. It's not an entirely easy argument to understand, because typically when we think about the Constitution, we think about, it's sort of restraining government. But at the state level, states have different functions than the federal government. And so the federal government doesn't provide for an education system, but the states do. And so it has to have a positive element. The way I guess I would characterize the argument is that if the Constitution requires the creation of a public school system, it has to be implied to prevent anything but a public school model. And so if any kind of resources from the state, even by one remove, get to someone outside of that public school system to provide some educational resources for them, that would be unconstitutional. Now, the argument's pretty broad, and I will be able to critique it a little bit later, but that's my take on the basic argument.
Christine, how would you characterize it? What is, in your mind, kind of the steelman or the generous reading of the UEA lawsuit, the argument they're making? And after we do this, by the way, I want to go through, because you both kind of very respectfully but soundly pick it apart in your op-ed. So I want to make clear to our listeners, we'll have the rebuttal. But Christine, anything that Bill missed, how can we understand just the basic arguments that they're putting forth in this lawsuit?
Bill's exactly right. And I think that the lawsuit boiled down says that because the Utah Constitution requires the state legislature to establish and maintain this free public school system open to all kids, that if the state also offers scholarships for students to attend schools that have different rules, that is a violation of kind of their requirement or mandate there. And then there's also this piece about the state not being able to contract out their ability to administer the program, and based on language about the Utah State Board of Education and their authority over public schools as well. So both of those together, I think, kind of represent what the lawsuit is trying to get at.
Christine, in simple terms, where is the UEA going wrong in the arguments that they're making in this, in your view?
The language of the Constitution doesn't prevent the creation of these types of programs. And this program existing doesn't eliminate the public education system or the public schools that they're required to establish and maintain. And in fact, the language of the Constitution says that the public education system shall include, and it goes through what you would think, the public elementary and secondary schools and other such schools and programs as the legislature may designate. So I think those will be key pieces as well to sort of rebut this idea that they're bringing forward.
Bill, what would you add to that? Because it sounds like there's some deeply flawed constitutional reasoning. If I'm understanding what you both are saying here and what you've said in your op-ed, which we'll of course include in the show notes for our listeners. But if the argument is, well, this program, because it is outside a particular structure that the UEA argues is sort of the has supremacy, for lack of a better term, it sounds like that's not actually at all what the Constitution says. The Constitution does allow for these other alternatives, and in fact, it empowers the legislature to create these. Is that the right reading?
That's right. I think the way Christine described it was really, really good. There's a basic logical fallacy to say that the state has a responsibility to provide education for children through a public school system. Of course, that makes good sense. But to read that to say, therefore, if there's some other resource that the state might want to provide for parents or children, particularly when you think about what's actually happening from day to day, which is that you've got children with very special needs, very different learning styles and things that will need access to other resources. And the state says, okay, well, we're going to provide that, and we'll do that maybe in a slightly different way. That additional effort to help students and parents doesn't become unconstitutional just because it's through a different route than some other programs the state does. And the language of the Constitution does say that the state board has power to as Christine mentioned, establish and maintain public schools, but also to administer other programs. And of course, there's all kinds of things the state will need to do in the process of providing education for children. And this is one that the legislature decided, and the people of the state have supported, that would allow for some of those resources to be provided in an alternative way. But again, providing for a public school system doesn't mean that you have to police out every other possible way that people might get access to education that they and their children need.
I want to read an excerpt from the op-ed from you two, and then ask you to weigh in on kind of the precedent. There are other examples of things that already exist that bolster the constitutionality of Utah Fits All. The excerpt from your op-ed, you both write, these arguments are based on, these arguments meaning what the UEA is proposing in their lawsuit. These arguments are based on an unreasonable reading of the Utah Constitution. A free public education system open to all children will continue to exist even if 10,000 low-income students use publicly funded scholarships to attend private schools. The Utah Constitution gives the Utah legislature broad authority to incorporate programs outside of public schools into the public education system. It's kind of echoing the point you just made, Bill. And there's two things as far as a precedent or a reference that seem to bolster this that I want to get both your takes on. Number one, Bill, for you, you've researched and written about before some religious freedom related cases, because one of the claims that critics of this program make on constitutional grounds is that, well, if somebody were to use these scholarship dollars to go toward a private entity or a private vendor that happens to be religious in nature, that would somehow violate the Constitution. But you and I have talked before about other cases in other states where the U.S. Supreme Court has kind of said, well, no, that's actually not the case.
Right. And you probably picked up on this in Christine's excellent summary that one of the arguments is that somehow these schools are not really open in the same way that the public schools are, and that's a problem. Well, again, for all the reasons we've talked about, I don't think that's really relevant. But the problem with that is that if you say, well, okay, because if you assume the argument is correct that we can't put any funding to any school that is not doesn't have exactly the same parameters of a traditional public school, that's unconstitutional. That means that then you're excluding schools based on their religious beliefs or on their attitudes about, the best ways that children might learn. And specifically in the religious context, the U.S. Supreme Court has struck down programs that say, hey, we're willing to give to private schools, but not to religious schools. So I think in some ways, one of the things that's concerning to me about the lawsuit is that this language of exclusion and that people are going to exclude someone and these schools might do that and that would be unconstitutional, I think it's a kind of a way of trying to insert that argument without saying, hey, we want to exclude religious schools. That would largely be the effect, is to exclude religious schools who do have, perhaps different rules about who might attend and the kinds of commitments they would have to make to attend their school. And so excluding them does run up against a real constitutional issue, which is you can't treat almost everybody the same way, but then to have a kind of a carve out that doesn't apply to people who want to use their support from the state to choose a religious option if that's what's best for them.
Christine, another angle of this seems to be the idea of again, precedent, not only just in the legal sense, as Bill is just articulating with some other cases at the U.S. Supreme Court level, but also precedent in terms of other existing programs that we have on the books that are very much an education choice type of program that my understanding is are very similar to Utah Fits All, that have been functioning. No one's been squawking about those, that if this lawsuit were to be successful, we'd lose out on some of these other things. Can you shed some light on that? Expand on how there are other reference points of programs that we have that actually can help answer this question before us right now.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So since 2005, Utah has had on the books this Carson Smith Scholarship, which is a voucher program that pays for the private school tuition for families that have students with special needs to attend those. And by the way, it's worth mentioning that this is a real voucher program, which means that the state pays directly for the tuition for them to attend, rather than putting money in account for the parents to individually and personally manage. And that distinction and that language actually is important and becomes relevant in other challenges. But then in 2020, the Utah legislature passed a special needs scholarship tax credit program. And, it is what it sounds like. It's funded through donations, and then the donors get a dollar for dollar tax credit on the other end. But it's also broader in its uses. So rather than just paying for private school tuition, it can be spent on textbooks and therapies and other things like that, recognizing that students with special needs might need a broad range of different services and help in education. So if you step back from all of this and you say, if this challenge is successful, what does it mean for these other programs? Now, the lawsuit doesn't actually name them or talk about those programs, but it is a question. And these are important programs in the state for families with special needs. And it seems like we have a track record in policymaking of understanding that certain students do need additional options, certainly students with special needs. But I think slowly we've also understood that every student probably needs an individualized education. So, just because there hasn't been a challenge yet to these programs doesn't mean that it's not relevant. But it is interesting, why now? Why this program is being challenged?
I want to shift to the policy lens because, as you both write in your op-ed for Deseret News, the lawsuit itself is sort of partial legal reasoning that, again, you both have articulated why that's flawed legal reasoning, but then it also seems to be a policy argument. And I want to read an excerpt from your op-ed again. You write, many of the arguments raised by the plaintiffs are policy disagreements, not constitutional objections. For example, the plaintiffs argue that the scholarship program will have a negative or harmful impact on public school funding, a common policy argument against educational choice programs. However, in 2023, the legislature enacted a policy to hold harmless public school funding even as public school enrollment is projected to decline. And you go on to write that basically this means that the scholarship program itself is not going to harm public education funding. That's still under the purview of the legislature to assign those dollars to the schools, independent of what the scholarship program would do in terms of its funding structure. So maybe, Christine, to start with you, and again, I want to get to in a minute sort of the folly of mixing policy and legal arguments in a lawsuit, and get your thoughts, Bill, on how that might affect how this progresses. But Christine, what are sort of the policy, what's the policy beef that the UEA has with Utah Fits All that they're trying to incorporate into this lawsuit argument?
Yes, this is a very common talking point, which is that you're siphoning funds away from public schools, and this will impact or harm public schools. And this sort of gets to the heart of this ongoing debate about the relationship between funds and academic outcomes, which is still fairly unclear. But I think to the point here is that enrollment doesn't necessarily have to equal how much funding is going to the schools. And I say that because the legislature makes those determinations. You mentioned this law about holding schools harmless, because there's a projection that enrollment will decrease over the next several years, and that's regardless of the scholarship program, right? Like that those are just projections in general about the population. But if they have the ability to say, hey, we're going to hold them harmless regardless of the decline in enrollment, what does that mean in general about how we fund schools? We can rely on the legislature to also help kind of navigate some of those waters as well.
So Bill, from your perspective, with this idea of kind of, again, mixing, I guess, policy and legal reasoning, there's a great line in the op-ed from you two that I want to read and then ask you to expand on, Bill. Kind of, again, with your constitutional law and legal reasoning, point out, is this a flawed approach for lawsuits? And you both write, policy preferences and constitutional requirements are not the same and should not be confused. The state courts are a forum for legal and constitutional reasoning, not a second chance for failed lobbying. Bill, put that into context with what's going on right now here with the UEA lawsuit.
Sure. The thinking behind that and is that the UEA opposed the program that allows some resources to get to parents and children, in an alternative way, to give them alternative education resources. And that was their right to do that. They can argue, they can say that's not good policy, and they made an attempt to convince the legislature. The legislature was unconvinced and created the program, and it's been moving forward since. And that's fine, and every organization, every individual can go to the legislature and say, I don't like this program. I'm going to vote in someone who agrees with me, or I'm going to make strong arguments that are going to convince people. What we can't do is to say, okay, well, we didn't like what the legislature did given its constitutional authority, so let's just pretend as if they didn't exist and try and get a different result from a different branch of government. The reason this is so challenging is it's foundational to constitutional law as a separation of powers. And the role of the legislature is to create exactly these programs. And the Utah Constitution makes clear that the state has that obligation and that the legislature are the ones to provide educational resources through a public school system and potentially in other ways as they've done here. And if the courts are invited to step in and say, well, actually, we think there's a better way to do this, or we think schools could run better this way, then we've lost that separation. The court's role is to make sure that the integrity of the language of the legislation and of the Constitution is protected. As long as they do that, then they don't need to worry about whether or not the legislature's done a good job or whether there's a better way of doling out money, or all of those kinds of questions really aren't court questions. They're legislative questions, and that's why we're concerned that the UA has gone this route and ignored the body that should be making a decision like this.
I want to ask both of you if the whole elevator pitch question, a little bit cliche, but I like it because it kind of focuses our message. If we're talking to regular Utahns, regular folks watching this debate, maybe seeing headlines here and there that haven't been diving in deep. So I'll pose this question to both of you and answer it in whatever way you want, given your respective areas of expertise and kind of how you view this issue. But if you're in an elevator with a Utah voter and they say, hey, Bill, hey, Christine, sounds like you think this program is legal, it's constitutional, and it's a good program. Tell me why. I've got 30 seconds. So I'll start with you, Bill. Why is it constitutional? Why is it good? And then we'll go to you, Christine. Why is it constitutional? Why is it good?
Well, my first reaction would be, say, to defer to Christine, who knows more about public education in Utah than probably anyone. But I think my basic answer would be that the state is meeting its constitutional obligation to provide a free public education for the students of Utah, and because it's doing that and won't change, that obligation. It also is free to recognize the reality there's a lot of differences in the way that children learn, the needs that they have, and that creating an alternative way to provide other resources to those who have that need is actually really consistent with the spirit of trying to help every student and every family in Utah succeed in education. I think that would be my basic take on that.
Christine, same question. You're 30 seconds in an elevator with a regular Utah voter, and they ask you, Utah fits all. Why is it constitutional? Why is it good?
Yeah, Bill did it just right. I mean, exactly. I think that the Constitution doesn't preclude these types of programs from existing. And from a policy perspective, these programs are important because there are families that need different options. It is as simple as that. Every student has individual needs, but some families are looking for options outside of what's already available to them to meet the needs of their children. And that is something that Utah has shown support for, and we ought to validate that and support these programs.
As we wrap up, we've got just a couple of minutes left. Kind of the last two questions I want to ask you both. Number one is this idea of what's next. So Christine, starting with you, give us a prediction. What do you think will happen with regard to this lawsuit? What do you think should happen?
Well, I like to think that it doesn't have merit and that it won't be successful. The challenge won't be successful. As far as even next steps beyond that, I think other states that are pursuing education choice programs, they ought to just anticipate this. I think most people, even in the state, anticipated a challenge like this to the program. And I think that is part of the, that's part of the work of advancing education choice is understanding the opposition as well.
Bill, what's next for this and what should happen?
Well, I agree with Christine's conclusions, and I would just maybe add that we're going to get a chance to hear, I think, two excellent sides. And there's parents who have an ability to kind of make the case for why they should have access to these resources. The state's going to be able to explain why the Constitution, how it should be understood. UAO will make its arguments, and I think we'll learn a lot about how people see education policy and what seems to be appropriate and what's not. I think as a result of that, hopefully that the state will leave with a greater, I hope and would even predict that this. I think that the courts will uphold this program because I think it clearly is constitutional. But that as a result, perhaps there'll be a greater understanding of the diversity of needs that parents and families experience in Utah, and that there'll be greater support for this really common sense program to try and meet those needs in a targeted way.
Well, we'll certainly be involved in that here at Sutherland. Christine, you've done tremendous work on this issue and others, and Bill, of course, on the legal and constitutional side. So I want to thank you both for coming on and sharing your time and expertise. This is an important issue that affects Utah families, as we've seen through our discussion with folks affected by this. And so I want to thank you both for doing that and helping shed some light on this, and I guess giving us a little bit of kind of a roadmap of what's going to happen moving forward on this issue. And Christine, as you said, maybe some ways that other states can learn from us. So thank you both very much for being with us on Defending Ideas today.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
Once again, that was Bill Duncan and Christine Cooke Fairbanks, two of our policy experts here at Sutherland. And we're going to take a quick break before we leave you with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before we close out this episode, there are a few notes that I captured that I think can help us in terms of talking points, so that if we end up in a conversation about Utah Fits All, a scholarship program here in our state, or education policy in general, education choice policy in general, we are better equipped to talk about it in a way that can hopefully be resonant with a lot of people and tone down some of the really intense rhetoric around this. And if we end up in one of these conversations, I think we can lead with our first point being this: we all agree that we want each child in our state to be able to have an education that meets their unique needs. Kids are different, and so they learn in different ways. And that means that parents having flexibility and options to choose from that empower them to select what's going to be most helpful for the learning and progression of their kids can be a really good thing in helping achieve that shared goal that we all have. Number two, the key point from our conversation today is that the Utah Fits All Scholarship is constitutional. As we heard from Bill and Christine, there isn't anything in state law, in the state constitution, that would prohibit the legislature from creating programs like this, especially because, as they outlined in the discussion and in their op-ed, there are other precedents we can point to, other programs that already exist that are similarly structured, and also other examples of court decisions, case law in other states that bolster that these kinds of programs can actually be within the law. And related to that is we have to recognize that a policy argument is not the same as a legal argument. As Bill said in the op-ed, the state courts are a forum for legal and constitutional reasoning, not a second chance for failed lobbying. And that's an important distinction we have to make today, is that policy disagreements are handled at the legislative level, which they were already when this bill passed and went into effect. Thirdly, we have to recognize that there are thousands of Utah students who have already been accepted into this program. They're excited about it. There are families that are counting on these funds. And the reason they're excited is because they're eager to learn. They're eager to use these resources to enhance and improve the education of their kids. Just like Cammie, the mother we talked to at the beginning of the episode. They're excited about this. This is going to help them and many other families enhance and improve what they're able to offer to meet the custom unique needs of their kids so that they can learn and progress in ways that are very meaningful for those families. So I think if we remember those points and work that into our conversations, that'll help this issue be discussed in a way that's more productive than maybe what you and I often see on social media, and also help to bolster, again, the constitutional defense and the policy merits of this kind of program here in Utah. That will do it for this episode of Defending Ideas. Thank you so much for being with us, spending some of your time with us today. If you liked what you heard, please visit defendingideas.org. You can access this and previous conversations. You can also subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, all the major platforms. Wherever you listen to your shows, search for Defending Ideas and click subscribe. You can also subscribe to the Sutherland Institute YouTube channel. And if you do, make sure you click the little bell icon in the corner when you're watching one of these episodes, so you get notified each time a new episode drops, which is every Tuesday morning. Again, all that and more at defendingideas.org. And lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this going out to the people of Utah and beyond, please visit sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. That's it for us today. From the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City, I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.